When you watch a movie, you see the finished, polished product, but you don't necessarily get to see all the failures that happened with the actors before they actually got what they were looking to make happen. And so when you watch outtakes, you get reminded of that fact. We're going to get to that in just a minute, but before we do, I just want to say welcome to you this morning. Thank you for joining us and tuning in to the Tannisborn Online Experience. You may be tuning back in from Easter last week, and if you are, you're among one of the over 700 people who tuned in last week. We were very excited about the opportunity we have to be making a difference in the life of people. And maybe you tuning in for the first time today or started tuning in the last few weeks. We just want to say welcome. And we want to say that we feel very honored that you would spend your morning with us. And so thank you for doing that. We hope that you're finding value add in these topics. We kicked off a series last Sunday called Rise, Turning Adversity into Advantage. And we're continuing that series this week. Why don't we remind you that as we're going through this difficult season right now, that we're all in this together. We're all experiencing a lot of the same difficulties together. And, when you're reminded of the fact that you're home from work and your kids are home from school, and sometimes the finances are tight in this situation, that we all need to be reminded that we can make it through these times of trouble and trial that we're going through. And I love this quote by Zig Ziglar. He says, "It's not how far you fall, but how high you bounce that counts." And so we all need to remember during this time, we need to have a little bit of resilience as we go through some challenging circumstances. And remember, as we go through this series, that we're designing this series to help you turn the lemons that you're being dealt right now into lemonade. I love this quote by Napoleon Hill. He says, "Every adversity, every failure, every heartache carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit." And I think we should be reminded of the fact that even if we're going through tough times, even if we're going through adversity, even if we might be experiencing failure after failure after failure, that we can turn these experiences into opportunities and advantages in our own life. And that's what we want to talk about as we talk today about redefining failure. I hope to help you get a new definition for failure in your life, see it from a different angle, have a different perspective on it. And I think it's interesting. I think of a small child, when they learn how to do things like crawl or roll over or walk, that failure seems to be pretty much a fact of life for a small child. And yet it doesn't seem to slow them down. Like I remember when we had a baby. We have two grown girls now, but when they were young, they were trying to roll over for the very first time, and it's amazing how much time and effort we spent watching them and cheering them on to try and help them to be able to roll over for the first time on their own, or take their first, not steps, but crawl for the first time, or take their first steps. And it's interesting that when a child takes its first steps and then falls over, they don't stop and give up. They get back up and they keep trying again and again and again until they get it right. Failure is just a fact of life. It's even interesting, we as parents, we celebrate these things. Like, I remember when my daughters, both of them, learned how to eat for the first time. And first they're taking food, and it's funny to watch them as they put it in their hand this way, and they try to cram their whole hand into their mouth to try and get the food in, and we get a good laugh out of that. But they don't give up when they can't get it to work. When they try that spoon, and it seems like they're getting more on the sides of their face than they actually get in their mouth, they don't give up. They keep trying. And then we celebrate things like, our kids are getting potty trained, and they're learning. And for the very first time, they leave a present in the toilet, and we're like, "Oh, you made a poopy!" And we celebrate that. We get all excited about it. And it seems like when children are young, we have no problem with failure. We're used to it. It's part of it's par for course, and we just go along with that. We celebrate it as they make small victories along the way. And then somewhere along the line, we begin to train our children that failure is not good. It's not something we should avoid it at all costs. And I think maybe part of this comes from the way we train our kids in school. Number one, I don't know of any course, at least I wasn't taught a course in school, on how to handle failure properly when you fail in school. There's no course on that. We have math and science and art and all that, but we don't have a course that teaches us how to fail correctly and how to do it successfully. And also, we have this grading system in school that goes A, B, C, D, F. F stands for fail. And we teach our children to avoid a fail at all costs, that it's not good if you fail. In fact, that becomes the real F word. Fail is the F word that we try to avoid at all costs. And so it becomes ingrained in us as we get older and older, and even as we go into adult life, we go to our work and we do everything we can to avoid failure at all costs. We minimize the risk because risk comes with the opportunity for failure. The thing is this, that failure can be painful. And I'm thinking of a specific failure in my life that was painful that has to do with school. When I was in college, I did a 4-year bachelor's program. And right before I graduated, I sent out graduation announcements to all my family and friends and was really excited about I was going to go graduate. I remember on a Monday, I was going to be graduating on a Thursday. I was going to walk across to get my diploma, and I had invited family and friends who were coming in from out of state to come watch that, to celebrate that with me and have a graduation party. And then I got a call Monday afternoon, I'll never forget it, 3 days before graduation, and I received a call from my school telling me that I had failed one of my courses, and I think passing was 60%. I had a 59.6%, 0.4% away from passing that class. I failed. I had to then go through and call all my family and friends up and tell them, don't show up, I'm not graduating. I'm not walking with my class. And that was a really hard failure for me to overcome. It was painful. But that's probably one of the reasons why we don't like failure, because failure can be very painful in our life. The fear of pain, by the way, when we avoid it because we're afraid of the pain that failure brings, the fear of that pain blinds us from opportunities that exist right in front of us. There's these opportunities we said last week that are brilliantly disguised as these obstacles and these challenges. And we're blinded by those because we're afraid of them because of the fear that are created from pain. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "There is meaning in every journey that is unknown to the traveler." And I think a lot of times when we're going through tough times, when we go through things where potential failure might happen, we're blinded by the fact that in that situation, there is something that is unknown to us as the traveler in the journey that brings meaning to our life. And we miss those opportunities because we're trying to avoid failure at all costs. Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the light bulb and invented a bunch of other things that were household items to us to this day, he says, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." I love that. Talk about redefining failure. He says, "I didn't fail at all. I just found 10,000 different ways that don't work. And now I know more about failure than in those areas than anybody else." No one's greatest learning, by the way, has ever come from their successes, but rather from their failures, from the darkest moments in our life. You think about this. Your greatest lessons in life have not come from your successes. You ask anybody you know, where did your greatest lessons in life come from? They won't point to their successes. They will point to their pain, to their dark moments, to the failures in their life. There's a guy in the Bible, a well-known guy, who is one of Jesus' closest disciples. He was one of his closest 3. His name was Peter. And Peter was known in the New Testament for all of his failures, his shortcomings, putting his foot in his mouth. And I listed out some highlights of Peter's failures that I want to share with you. Peter was the one disciple when there was a storm out on a lake, and it was nighttime. Jesus approaches the boat walking out on the water, and Peter sees him and is like, "Jesus, is that you?" And he's like, "Yes." He's like, "If that's you, ask me to get out of the boat and come to you." So Jesus says, "Sure, go ahead, come on out here." And Peter gets out, and he's actually walking on water. But then he gets distracted by all the waves and the wind, and he gets scared, and he starts to sink in. And Jesus has to reach out and save him because Peter got scared during that moment. He took his eyes off Jesus. Peter, at one point in time, was caught arguing. Now, he's a disciple of Jesus. Jesus is like this servant leader. He's all about humility. He's all about the last will be first and the first will be last. And you want to, give up the rights to everything that you could claim and be the last person and serve the other people and all that kind of stuff. This is the guy that Peter's following. And Peter is caught with other disciples arguing among themselves about who is the greatest. Then there's this situation where Peter, James, and John, Jesus' closest 3 companions, are with him, and he's up on a mountain, and lo and behold, 2 historical figures from their past, from the past of the Scriptures, Elijah and Moses, appear with Jesus on the mountain, and they're talking to him. And Peter, no one's asking Peter for help or saying anything to Peter. They're kind of, the 3 of them are having a conversation, and Peter just kind of spouts out, he's like, "Jesus, do you want us to build you and Elijah and Moses a shelter?" And I can imagine when he said that, he's probably like, "Did I just say that out loud? Like, why was I even thinking that? What was I doing?" Then there's the situation where Jesus was predicting that he was going to have to die for the sins of the people. He was going to have to sacrifice himself. And Peter, thinking of his own agenda, said, "No, Jesus, you can't do that. You won't do that." And Jesus actually scolds Peter. And he has to say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, because what you want is not what God wants and what I want to happen." He basically has to put Peter in his place in that situation. Then there's, we talked about this last week for Easter, there's the night before Jesus was crucified on the cross. And he and his disciples, Jesus and his disciples are all gathered together, and Jesus shows the ultimate example of servanthood by washing his disciples' feet. He's going through one by one to wash them. Peter, thinking that that's just not cool, he says, Jesus, you don't need to wash my feet. And Jesus pauses and says, well, if I can't wash your feet, then you have no place in my ministry. He's basically saying, you need to be humble enough to let me wash your feet as I serve you. So Peter's just constantly known for all these little mess-ups and mistakes that he does, but probably his biggest flub is the ultimate thing. It was later on that same evening that Jesus washed his feet. Peter, when they're in a meal, declares in front of all of Jesus' disciples, he says, I don't care if I have to give my life, I'm not deserting you, I'm not leaving you. I'm with you till the end, Jesus. And Jesus turns to him and says, actually, tonight, you're going to deny that you even knew me 3 times. Peter's like, no, that won't happen. All the disciples, yeah, that won't happen. And then there's an account of that. And the author Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, he records this situation. This is the last time that Peter, in fact, did deny Jesus. The 3rd time Matthew records, Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. He's talking to people to say, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples? He says, I don't even know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed, and suddenly Jesus' words flashed back through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And he went away weeping bitterly. Wow. Wow, can you imagine that? This is Jesus, the Son of God. You're one of his closest 3. You just told him earlier on that evening that even if you have to give your life, you're going to be with him till the bitter end. And then you get scared because of what's going on, and you start associating with him and tell people who ask you, aren't you with him? Aren't you associated with him? Nope, I don't even know him. Just to save your own butt. That's the Peter that we're talking about. So as we talk today about redefining failure, that's a pretty big failure to try and come back from. I want to ask the question, how do we come back from failure? How do we come back from these things that we mess up? We just feel like there's the point of no return. We can't get back from it. We can't recover from it. I believe we need to have some corrections to our assumptions about failure and what it is. We have some misconceptions. And in fact, I want to point out two myths about failures. There's plenty of myths about failures, but I want to point out 2 specific myths about failure that I believe messes us up and gets us to avoid failure as opposed to embracing what failure can do for us. And so here's the first myth that I want to talk about, and that is failure is optional. There's this myth going out there that failure is optional, that we're somehow supposed to avoid it at all costs. We go through life trying to avoid failure, and we even keep score, like how many times we succeed versus failing. And if it gets to be too many, we begin to wonder, no longer am I just failing, but now maybe I'm, by very identity, maybe I am a failure. And we start to feel that way. And so we keep this score, and the least amount of times that we fail, we feel good about those times. And when we start failing a lot, we start feeling like, oh, we are a failure. We as ourselves are a failure. And we do everything we can to avoid failure at all costs. The wisest man who ever lived penned these words in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, not a single person on earth is always good and never sins. Saying, out of all the people on the earth, there's not one of them who always does the right thing and never sins. We all sin at some point in time. Now, the word sin in the church world is used as a label for bad behavior. Sin literally means, from the earliest Bible translation, sin literally means to miss the mark. And I think of like a bullseye, like an archery bullseye target where or like a dartboard, and you throw a dart at it. The bullseye, that's the not sin, and everything else around that and everything off the dartboard, that's sin. And it's very hard for us to be able to get everything right and never mess up. Sin is essentially failing to live up to God's standard of perfection. God has a standard of perfection that he wants us to strive for. And every time we miss that, that's sin. That's messing up. That's failing. When we avoid failure at all costs, and we do everything we can to succeed, it creates pride in us. I think that's a problem. It's a form of perfection. And pride sabotages success. So I would like to pose for you that nothing fails like success in our lives. So all we do is we try to avoid failure at all costs. We want to get it right every time. And that's a form of perfection that leads to pride that makes us feel like, oh, if we even thought we could do that, we think pretty highly of ourselves. That pride sabotages us and causes us to fail. Our success actually leads to future failure rather than future success. Dennis Waitley says this, and by the way, I believe this is probably the only way you can avoid failure in your life. There is one exception to avoiding failure, and it's this. Failure is something we can avoid only by saying nothing, doing nothing, and being nothing. See, if you want to be anything in life, if you want to move forward, if you want to take action on anything in your life, you have to be open to the possibility that you will fail, because it's going to happen. We cannot avoid failure when we move forward. There's always going to be risk involved. This week, you're going to be set forth with some challenges or some things that you need to do, and you can choose not to do them and avoid failure, and you don't have any risk or pain involved in it, or you can choose to move forward and realize there may be a risk, there may be pain involved, but you can't avoid failure if you want to move forward and make progress in your life. The point isn't just to avoid failure. The point is to learn from it, which leads us to the truth. The myth is that failure is optional. The truth is this: failure is a prerequisite for success. Failure is a prerequisite for success. I think we try to avoid failure partially because it can feel like weakness in our life. I know that when I failed in the past, it makes me feel less than, makes me feel weak, makes me embarrassed, ashamed, and we feel weak when we fail. I think that's just a natural tendency for us to just kind of feel less than in those situations. The author Paul in the New Testament, one of the church leaders of the New Testament, writes this letter to this church in the ancient town of Corinth. And as he's writing to them, he's talking about how he had weakness in his own life. And he asked 3 times for God to take away the weakness. And this is what he records as a response. Each time he, God, said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me." That's Paul speaking. He says, "That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." See, I believe that failure is unavoidable. If we're going through life, if we're humans, which we are, got a heartbeat, we're going to face failure. And the question isn't, can we avoid it? The question is, what are we going to do with it when we're faced with it? I believe whereas success leads to our future failure if we allow it to build us up with pride, I believe that failure can lead to future success. And here's how that works. When we fail, if we're willing to be honest about it, if we're willing to accept it, then it creates humility in us. Because I don't know about you, but every time I failed, it can be a humbling experience. And when we own up to that, when we admit it to the people around us who, by the way, saw it happen and know that we failed, when we're willing to admit it and be honest with them, it creates a humility inside of us. And you know what humility does? Humility makes us teachable. It makes us a teachable person. And when we're teachable, we're open to learning from our failure and gaining wisdom from it. So failure leads to humility, which leads to teachability, which leads to wisdom, and that wisdom leads to our future success, because when we learn, by the way, reflection on our past experiences leads to insight. That insight prevents us from future failure. So failure actually leads to success rather than the other way around. John Maxwell said, "Too many people fail to learn from their experiences because they focus on their losses and not on the lessons." We can't focus on the losses in failure. We need to focus on the lessons. Every time you fail, the question to ask is, what can I learn? What can I learn from what just happened there? That's what's happening with a small child when they learn to walk. They learn when they fall over that maybe their balance was off, and so next time they get up, they're a little more careful about that, or they try to set back a little bit further. When they're learning to eat, they learn that the spoon has to go in their mouth to give them the food. And so they learn better and better ways of doing that until one day they actually don't get food on their face. But we learn through our failures, unless, of course, we're blinded by them and we do everything we can to avoid them, and we just kind of shove them under the carpet, try to pretend they didn't happen. Mark Twain said this, "I knew a man who grabbed a cat by the tail and learned 40% more about cats than the man who didn't." That's very true. When you learn something from a failure, it helps you prevent that failure from happening in the future. And I actually have a cat situation. I remember when I was about 4 years old, I had an older brother who was 6 years old. I remember this cat that wandered around our neighborhood. It was out in front of our house. I remember distinctly, my brother and I don't know why we were doing this. I can't tell you my thought process, but we were taking piles of dirt and bark dust and pine needles and dumping them on the back of this cat, who did not take very kindly to it and let us know that by reaching out really, like before I could blink, like spinning around and biting my thumb, putting 2 puncture marks in my thumb, shook itself off and was off running before we even knew what had happened. I learned very quickly that failure is painful sometimes. But I'll tell you this, I can assure you, in the last 40 years, I've never done that to a cat again. I've learned to respect cats in that situation and knowing what they can do, how they can inflict harm on me, and I've learned from that situation. We all have cats in our life, situations we ran into that we've learned from, and we've learned never to do those mistakes again because we were willing to pick up a lesson when we had the failure. Ironically, failure isn't the enemy of success. Success is the enemy of success. So as we move on, that's the first myth I want to talk about. The second myth I want to give you is this. Failure is fatal. Somehow we got it in our heads that failure is fatal, that failure is final, that it is terminal, that it's something we can't come back from. I remember one specific failure in my life, one that whenever we've had like a crowd, like a mixer and a group of people, and they say, what's your most embarrassing experience, which hasn't been asked many times, but it's been asked a couple times. The first thing that comes to my mind is the time when I was younger, in my early 20s, and I was learning to play the piano, and I played it for our church, and I could do really well for the songs we played at church, but then it came to a Christmas Eve service, and Christmas music, unbeknownst to me, is a lot of jazz chords, a lot of complicated stuff, and I committed to playing the piano for our Christmas Eve service, and it was way over my head for what I could actually pull off. And I remember going through song after song after song during that service, being on the stage, dying 1,000 deaths as I kept messing up. Sometimes I actually had to stop and pause and start back up again. It was that bad. It was awful. I couldn't believe it. And then we kind of peppered songs throughout the whole Christmas Eve service. The pastor gave a talk, and at the very end, we closed out with the last song. And I'll never forget on that last song that I was playing it through, and after being flustered from going this whole service, messing up time after time after time, I was just embarrassed beyond belief. I messed up just royally and had to start the song over. And I was so flustered by the end of that song that I didn't know what else to do. And I finished the song and I turned out to everybody in the audience and I said, "Goodbye, get out of here." And that was it. And as soon as those words left my lips, I was like, did I just say that out loud? I was so mortified, so embarrassed by what I had done that I actually walked off the stage, behind the stage, into a back room, and I hid back there until everyone had left so that I didn't have to face everybody after all this embarrassing stuff I had just done, all the failures that had happened in that service. You know what's interesting about that? That when I've told that story to people who were there that day, not one of them remembers that experience. Not one of them saw it the way I saw it. I saw that failure as a fatal thing, like it was going to be like a career breaker for me because I could never come back from it. But the people that were closest to me, who experienced it with me, they don't even remember it. It wasn't even something that stuck in their mind. We take the failures in our life and we make them stick with us so much bigger than they actually are. And I think that's interesting how we do that. Proverbs 24:16, the wisest man who ever lived, again, same guy, penned these words. He says, "The godly may trip several times, but they will get up again." The godly may trip 7 times, but they will get up again. What's he saying there? He's saying that if you're living the way you should, if you're going the course you should, the course that God has laid out for you, and you fall down, you're going to get back up again, and you're going to do it over and over. He says 7. I'm sure he could say 70 or 700. The point is, when we make a mistake, we get back up. We brush ourselves off, and we keep going. I love this definition of success. Success is getting up one more time than you've been knocked down. It reminds me of that 80s song. I think it's an 80s song where the lyric goes, "I get knocked down, but I get up again. No, you're never going to keep me down." I won't sing it for you, but I remember that lyric because that's really, to me, what success is. You may get knocked down, but you keep getting back up, and success is getting up one more time than you've been knocked down. You got to get up one more time. Every time you get knocked down, you get up one more time. Here's the truth. Failure is fatal is the myth. The truth is this. Failure and success go hand in hand. See, not only is failure not fatal, it's a vital and necessary part of success. It's bedfellows with success. Winston Churchill was known for this statement. He says, success, and he said this during World War II, success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. I love that. See, success has a lot to do with our failures. And then Robert Kiyosaki says, winners are not afraid of losing, but losers are. Failure is part of the process of success. People who avoid failure also avoid success. See, failure is not only not fatal, it's a vital part of our success. The author James in the New Testament writes in one of the books of wisdom in the New Testament, he writes these words. He says, "Blessed is the man who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." We're going to go through trials in life, and a lot of those trials will lead us to failures. But if we go through those things and we persevere through them, James says that it'll lead to us receiving a crown of life that God has promised, a reward that God gives us. There's a reward that comes from from persevering and being determined to keep getting up every time we get knocked down, keep getting up and continue forward. See, the opposite of success is not failure. The opposite of success is inaction. Only way to not succeed is to just stay still and do nothing. Whereas if we move forward and we fail, that's not opposite of success, that's the road to success. You need to fail to be able to progress forward. I think of NBA icon Michael Jordan, who is known in the 80s and 90s as one of the best basketball players who ever lived. He says this, he says, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games, and 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed." But he goes on to say, "I failed over and over again in my life." And he says that the reason he became the best was because of his constant failure, and that he used that failure to motivate him to drive for success. See, failure is it's part of the road to success. There's a short story, and then we'll move on, about a guy in the 1950s. His name was Truett, and he had two brothers. One of them, his brother Ben, and Truett got together, and they actually founded a restaurant together called the Dwarf Grill just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And the restaurant, from the week it opened up, became very successful and profited from the very first week. And for 3 years, enjoyed great success until the unthinkable happened. Truett received news that both of his brothers, Ben and his other brother, died in a private plane crash. He lost both of his brothers and his business partner, just like that. But he went ahead to recover from that emotionally and moved on. And in the course of the next year, the business began to see success again. And so he opened up a second restaurant. A year after that, guess what happens? The second restaurant burns down in a fire. And adding insult to injury, he had no insurance. Almost sunk him. It almost sunk him down. A few weeks later, when the owner of a business that's failing like that is trying to pick up the pieces and move forward, he finds out that he's got polyps in his colon. And he has to go in for 2 surgeries to remove them, and ends up in the hospital for several months. You'd think, man, at that point in time, you might think about throwing in the towel and giving up, but that's not what Truett did. When he was in the hospital, he dreamed of a new concept. For a while, the restaurant had offered a boneless chicken breast on its menu, and what would happen, he thought, if I took that chicken breast, seasoned it, and fried it just right, and put it on a bun with the right condiments. The answer became the Chick-fil-A sandwich, and the start of one of the largest privately owned restaurants in the world. That's what happens when you keep moving forward. He got knocked down. He got some pretty big knockdowns, but he kept getting back up, brushing himself off and moving forward. And when we get back up one more time, then we get knocked down, and we learn from our failures and we move forward, that's where we see success. In fact, there's a book that story came out of called Failing Forward. I've got a copy right here, one of my favorite books. In fact, this is my wife's favorite book of all time. She loves this book. And if you want a great book to go beyond what we're talking about today and learning about how we can read a new definition of failure and to move forward, when we fall forward, we can get back up and continue moving forward. This is a great book. That story that I just told you about is in this book, as well as many other stories of inspiration, some encouragement, and some guidance to help you learn how to fail forward. Dennis Waitley, right? Oh, and by the way, let me go back and just say this book, if you want a copy of it, there's a link for it to Amazon in your notes there, right in where the chat window appears, and you can order yourself a copy. I highly encourage you to do that if you haven't got that book before. Now, I want to share with you a quote from Dennis Waitley. We quoted him earlier. He says, "Failure should be our teacher, not our undertaker. Failure is delay, not defeat. It is a temporary detour, not a dead end. Failure is not fatal." Lance Armstrong, the biker, famous biker, says this: "Pain is temporary. Quitting lasts forever." Think about that the next time you're tempted to give up or quit because you failed. We got to get up one more time, then we fall, get knocked down. We got to continue to move forward. That's how we get to success. If we view failure in the right way, here's the result. You can see this in your notes. Our failures do not define us. They refine us. Failure sharpens us. It takes us down the path and shows us which way to go. And it doesn't define us. We are not defined by our failures. You think about all the great people in the history of the world that we look up to and see as legends and icons and heroes. And they're not defined by their failure, although they had many on the road to success. They're defined, or they're refined by their failures. They're defined by the successes that really happen as a result of them moving forward and continuing on the course. We left Peter, poor Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, back at the beginning of our talk today, with the biggest flub of all flubs, denying Jesus, denying that he ever knew him. He was so embarrassed and so ashamed of what he had done. But Jesus ends up restoring Peter and comes back and tells Peter, hey, if you love me, I want you to feed my sheep. I want you to move forward and continue on the ministry that I started here. And in fact, in your notes, the words of Jesus to Peter in Matthew records this: now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock. Peter's name was Simon, and Jesus changed his name to Peter, which means rock. And he says, upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Peter goes on to be one of the most influential and most important figures and leaders in the early church as it gets off the ground. What he did was vital and essential to the beginning of the early church after Jesus left and went back to heaven. Peter was only able to do that because he was able to get back and to get past his failures. I think one of the reasons for Peter's success is that he wasn't afraid to fail. Yeah, he put his foot in his mouth all the time. Yeah, he made mistakes all the time. He had to backtrack. But I believe it's because he was unwilling to give up. He was willing to keep moving forward and move past his failures to learn from them, that he became one of the founding fathers of the early church. By the way, the verse that I just read you, that Jesus quotes, he says that you're the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. He said that before Peter denied him. And he also said that knowing that Peter would deny him. He believed in Peter. He saw his future. I'm here this morning to tell you, I don't know necessarily all of you personally, but I do know this: you're going to fail. Some of you are going to fail big, but it's not your failure that's going to define you. I believe you have the power to rise up. We're talking about rising out of adversity. I believe you have the power to rise up and to overcome those failures, to move forward. So if it's not the quality or the quantity rather and the depth of our failures that matters, it's rather how we respond to them. The lesson to learn here is that the only true failure in life is the failure to learn. Eloise Rustad says this: when we give ourselves permission to fail, we at the same time give ourselves permission to excel. And Chris Hardwick says this: no human ever became interesting by not failing. The more you fail and recover and improve, the better you are as a person. You ever meet someone who's always had everything worked out for them with zero struggle? They usually have the depth of a puddle, he says. And he goes on to say, or they don't exist. I think that's so true. Interesting people aren't people who avoid failure. They're not people who are perfect in every way. They're people that learn from their failures. They got back up, brushed themselves off, and went forward in spite of those failures. People, by the way, are not endeared to us because of our level of success. They, in fact, are drawn to us when we're honest and humble about both our successes and our failures, our strengths and our weaknesses. If you've made a mistake, own up to it. If you make a mistake this week, own up to it. Then the lessons that you learn, or then learn the lessons, by the way, from failure and decide to improve on what you've learned. Decide to take action. Don't just learn a lesson, but put that lesson into action. I got some next steps. If you're clicking that connection card link today, and you want some next steps to kind of suggest how you can move forward and overcome and redefine failure in your life. The first one I want to point out is I will look for the lessons in my failures this week. We're all going to fail this week. That's inevitable. We're all going to fail. The question is, are you going to learn a lesson from it? Are you going to be able to course correct as a result of a lesson you learned from the failure this week? The second suggested next step, I will risk failure this week by, and there's a blank for you to fill in for you what that is. What is the risk that you need to take this week that may have pain attached to it? It may be something you mess up. You could actually fail in doing it. But it's a calculated risk. It's something you need to step forward and do to be able to fail forward, to be able to move forward. You might, who knows, you might avoid pain. You might avoid the failure that could come with it. But the point is, you got to move forward. And what is that thing that you want to risk failing this week? The last one there, I will memorize the words of James in James 1:12, who said, blessed is the man who endures trials, because when he has withstood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Those are great words to commit to memory, to remind you when you're going through tough times not to give up, to continue to stay the course. Not only are others drawn to us when we admit and own our failures, when we admit our weaknesses, but also God is drawn to us when we admit that stuff. We talked earlier about the words of the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon, saying that no one on earth has escaped, doing anything wrong. We all are wrong at some point in time or another. Well, the author Paul, when he's writing to the church in ancient Rome, says, "For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard." Me included, you included. We all mess up. And then it can be incredibly hard and maybe even painful to own up to the mistakes that we've made, especially as we're trying to admit that to God. That can be a tough thing. But 1 John 1:9 this is the good news. The author John writes these words: "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." There's a solution there. We can admit, we can own up to our faults, we confess them to God. It says that God is faithful and he's going to forgive us of those sins. They're not terminal. They don't stop us from moving forward. God's grace is bigger than any mistake that we can make, and he's going to forgive us for those mistakes. I believe that God wants a relationship with us, but that's only possible. It's only possible if we admit that we need him. As Paul said, God's strength comes through in my weakness. When we own up to our mistakes and we own our weaknesses, we own our failures, we got to admit that we need God, that we can't do it on our own. So every time we think we can, that's when the pride creeps in and it sabotages us and we can't succeed in those moments. But it's in owning those failures and being humble, being honest about them, that we're able to move forward and we can accept God and his love and his strength into our life. And I want to invite you, if you've never done that before, I want to invite you that today might be the day you could do that. And it's tough to admit to God that you've made mistakes and that you need him in your life. You can't do life without him. That's a tough thing. That makes you very vulnerable, and it's a humbling position to be in. But I want to tell you, you don't have to be scared. You don't have to be nervous about that, because God loves you. And he's attracted to that weakness when we admit our weaknesses. And he wants to do great things in you. He wants to complete perfect work in our life. He wants to see us rise above and see our full purpose that he designed us for to be realized in our life. He loves you. Can I invite you to accept Jesus? If you do that today, you'll be among the 29 people in the last 3 weeks who have made that very same decision tuning into the Tannisborn Online Church experience. You're not alone if you make that decision. There are many people who are making that choice right now. And I want to invite you to do that. If you want to know and accept the God who made you to love you, the one who gave his son Jesus to die for you so you can have a relationship with him, I'm going to just say a prayer here in a moment out loud. Simple prayer. And this prayer could be a way of you just saying, God, I understand I need you in my life. I believe in you. I admit that I'm incomplete without you. I confess my brokenness, my failures to you. I want to receive you into my life. And I don't have all the answers figured out, but as best as I know how from this day forward, I want to live my life for you. And if that's you today, I invite you to say these words in your own heart as I say them out loud. Heavenly Father, please forgive my sins. Jesus, save me and make me new. Fill me with your Spirit so I can follow you and serve you the rest of my life. Use me to shine your light, to show your love, and to spread your hope. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for saving me. My life is not my own. I give it all to you. God, we ask that in your presence today, you would reveal your love and your goodness to those who need you all over the world. And God, I pray that you will help everyone tuning in today, including myself, to be able to reframe how we view failure. Help us to take this new perspective on failure and use it for our advantage. That we would be able to humbly learn from our mistakes, to help us make better choices when we face the same situations in the future. Help us during this series to see that when we face adversity, it can grow us and make us stronger. That it will build our character, and that we can use our adversity to our advantage. Help us this week to be intentional on taking action, knowing that when we do that it's always a risk, and there are opportunities to fail. But ultimately, avoiding failure isn't the point. Help us in our moments of weakness to gain our strength from you, and that you would use our failures to refine us into the people you want us to become. Thank you, God. Amen.